Hello, my dear friends. A Victorian Woman's Day did not begin with clean water, but with perfume sprayed on dirty skin and tangled hair. Flowing dresses hid the sweat, bacteria, and body odor that accumulated over the weeks. They combed their hair full of lice, bathed in recycled water filled with dead bugs, and believed that ashes and urine could be used to beautify. What was once a rumor was once a fact that the entire society kept silent about. Tonight, you will enter the horrifying world of hygiene hidden beneath the elegance of Victorian women. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to step inside the bedroom of a Victorian lady at the start of the day, the sight would not be of a basin filled with water waiting for her to wash. Instead, a folded cloth dampened with vinegar or scented solution would be ready on the table. She would press it gently to her face, believing that this was safer than splashing water. Clean water was not trusted, especially in cities where pipes ran close to drains and where fear of cold or disease lingered. The cloth left a faint sting on the skin, and the smell of vinegar clung to her cheeks. This was not a matter of choice for one woman. It was a pattern repeated across houses, both large and small, forming what passed for cleanliness. Perfume followed quickly. Bottles stood proudly beside mirrors, cut glass, catching the first light of the morning. The liquid inside was sharp and heavy, designed to overpower any trace of sweat or oil. She sprayed her neck, dabbed her wrists, and combed the scented liquid into her hair. The air of the room filled with the smell, which did not fade but thickened as more was applied. It is almost laughable that this cloud of fragrance, praised as refinement, was often enough to make servants retch. Yet for the lady herself it was proof of status and respectability. A body washed with water might still be suspected of poverty, but a body drowned in perfume could never be mistaken for common. The routine was not gentle. Perfumes were mixed with alcohol and oils that burned the skin when applied too often. Women accepted the redness and irritation as part of the price of beauty. Their gowns layered and heavy trapped sweat against the skin. But instead of washing, they only added more perfume. Scarves and gloves were sprayed before being worn. Even bed sheets and curtains were not spared, soaked in scent so that the entire household carried the same scent. The fragrance reached every corner, clinging stubbornly to fabrics that were rarely washed. This practice also reflected fear. Water, especially cold water, was believed to damage health. Doctors spoke of chills and nervous weakness, and families repeated these warnings until they became tradition. A cloth with vinegar was seen as a protective barrier, guarding against invisible dangers. Perfume did more than hide odor. It was believed to fight them, to cleanse the air itself, and to act as a shield against decay. To wash in water was to invite risk. To cover in perfume was to remain safe. The irony grows sharper when one remembers the true conditions of Victorian towns. Streets were filled with coal dust, smoke from factories, and the stench of horse manure. Homes collected soot on windowsills and walls. People walked daily through filth, then returned to rooms heavy with unwashed fabrics. Yet the first action each morning was not to remove dirt, but to bury it under stronger smells. If we compare this habit to the present, it would be like refusing to shower for a week and spraying bottle after bottle of cheap deodorant, convincing ourselves that the problem is solved. The absurdity is plain, but in Victorian life it was routine. Perfume also carried weight beyond hygiene. It marked social boundaries. The poor could not afford strong bottles of imported scent, and so the smell of sweat revealed their class. The wealthy could afford to buy the illusion of cleanliness. Perfume became a sign of belonging, a marker that one was part of respectable society. To walk into a drawing room without scent was to risk shame. Better to choke others with fragrance than to allow a hint of natural odor. I find it disturbing to imagine myself in one of those closed parlors, surrounded by layers of perfume so thick that breathing would feel like swallowing smoke, while the women smiled and believed themselves at their best. The strength of perfumes was extreme. Recipes called for concentrated oils, musk and resins. A single spray lingered for hours, and multiple layers created an almost tangible haze. In gatherings, where dozens of women met in rooms with sealed windows, the air became oppressive. Guests felt faint, servants grew ill, but silence was the rule. To complain was to appear unrefined, so everyone endured. What mattered was the appearance of elegance, not the comfort of those forced to inhale. Children learned these habits early. Young girls watched their mothers and copied them. They dabbed scent on their own small wrists and necks, practicing for the day they would be judged as women. The fear of water and the reliance on perfume were taught as lessons of discipline. To break with the custom would invite criticism, and so the pattern continued. An entire generation grew up convinced that fragrance meant health and respectability. Inside homes, bottles were displayed like treasures. Guests could see them shining on the dressing table, proof of refinement. Each morning began with the same ritual, the same cloud of scent, the same avoidance of water. Discomfort such as rashes, headaches or nausea were ignored. They were minor sacrifices compared to the greater goal of looking refined. In this way, the practice embedded itself so deeply that it seemed natural, even inevitable. The reality, however, was filth hidden beneath perfume. Skin remained unwashed, pores clogged with oil and dirt, gowns absorbed sweat that was never rinsed away, scarves carried the smell of old perfume mixed with human odor. Behind the mask of roses and lavender was the truth of decay. The more it was hidden, the more it grew. But as long as appearances held, society approved. The mourning ritual of vinegar cloths and perfume bottles stands today as one of the most telling signs of Victorian contradiction. It reveals a culture that prized appearance above health, illusion above truth. It shows how fear and fashion work together to create habits that now seem absurd. The idea that water could harm while perfume could cleanse is a reminder of how belief can outweigh reason. They believed perfume was enough to keep appearances intact. Beneath the gowns, sweat and dirt stayed trapped against the skin. The elegant fabric was only a cover for layers of hidden filth. The sight of a Victorian lady walking in public was one of apparent elegance. Her gown swept the ground, decorated with ribbons, lace, and often trimmed with elaborate stitching. To the eye of passers-by, she carried herself with dignity, her clothing suggesting wealth, refinement, and morality. Yet beneath this image was a reality that no one wanted to acknowledge. The very garments that marked her status were at the same time containers of filth, sweat, and bacteria. The longer one looks past the polished exterior, the more the contradictions appear. The typical gown was not a single layer. Women wore 3, 4, and sometimes 5 layers of fabric, each pressed tightly against the other. The outer layer was the most elaborate, meant to be seen and admired. Beneath it came heavy skirts, petticoats, and undergarments that clung to the body. The lowest layer was the chemise in direct contact with the skin, soaking up sweat day after day. This structure created the volume and shape admired in the era, but it also created a warm prison, where moisture and dirt had nowhere to escape. Clothes that looked splendid on the street hid the stink of a body trapped beneath them. Daily washing of clothing was not considered practical. A gown could weigh several kg, and laundering required hours of soaking, scrubbing, and drying. For many families, the idea of cleaning all those layers more than once a month was unrealistic. Instead, sweat and grime built up silently. Stains on the outer gown might be covered with ribbons or additional lace, but the inner garments remained untouched. A chemise worn directly against the skin might be used for a week or more before being changed. The fabric darkened with sweat, absorbed oils, and became a perfect ground for bacteria. It is almost absurd that the very symbol of purity and femininity was in truth a collection of unwashed cloths steeped in bodily fluids. The physical experience was stifling, with corsets binding the waist and petticoats pressing down. Air circulation was nearly impossible. Even in cool weather, women sweated under the weight of the layers. In summer, the discomfort reached unbearable levels. But since the outer layer gave the impression of control and refinement, the hidden suffering was dismissed. To remove layers in public would have been scandalous. The standard of appearance demanded endurance, no matter the personal cost. We might wonder why women accepted this burden. The answer lies in the culture of the time. Cleanliness was defined not by actual washing, but by outward appearance. A spotless gown, even if only superficially cleaned, counted more than washed skin or laundered linen. To wear multiple layers was a sign of modesty and virtue. The weight of the clothing symbolized discipline. In such a world, to admit discomfort or to seek daily change of garments was to risk looking wasteful or improper. If compared to the present, it would be like wearing the same set of gym clothes every day for a week, spraying them with perfume, and still expecting others to admire them as a sign of elegance. The practice appears shocking now, but it was not questioned then. Disease found opportunities here. A damp cloth held against the body became a breeding ground for infections. Skin rashes, sores and fungal problems were common, though rarely spoken of. Doctors sometimes advised lighter garments, but fashion ruled stronger than medicine. Women suffered in silence, often blaming their own weakness instead of the clothing itself. What mattered was the facade. As long as the outer gown sparkled in public, the hidden layers could be left to rot. The lower classes copied these habits as much as they could. Even if they lacked the money for fine gowns, they layered cheap fabric to mimic the style. The result was the same sweat trapped in cloth, dirt absorbed day after day. The illusion of refinement spread beyond the wealthy, shaping expectations across society. The pursuit of elegance ensured that hygiene remained secondary. I cannot help but picture the exhaustion of carrying such weight daily, the skin chafing beneath, and the knowledge that beneath each ribbon and lace was nothing but unwashed fabric pressing against the body. The smell was inevitable. Servants who helped women dress could not ignore it, but they said nothing. Layers of perfume were sprayed to hide the odor, combining with the scent of sweat to form something far more pungent. In crowded spaces, such as theaters or dance halls, the mixture became unbearable, but to comment on it was unthinkable. Everyone pretended that the smell of refinement was natural. Silence was safer than honesty. Practical attempts at cleaning were minimal. Women might hang their gowns near an open window to air them, but actual washing was rare. Some rubbed small patches with cloths dipped in starch or vinegar, but this only moved the dirt rather than removing it. Outer layers received the most attention, while the shem and petticoats were ignored. The unseen layers pressed tightly against the skin carried the greatest burden. The contradiction was striking. The same society that condemned filth in the streets tolerated it in their homes and clothing. Outward elegance excused inner decay. A woman was judged by the shine of her outer gown, not by the state of the layers beneath. This disconnect reveals how deeply appearances ruled Victorian life. The gown became a symbol of respectability, even as it hid the very opposite of cleanliness. Clothing makers and laresses profited from this system. They knew women would buy more lace and ribbons to cover stains rather than wash entire garments. Fabric dealers encouraged the layering fashion since more cloth meant more sales. The system continued because it served the economy, not because it made sense for hygiene. To question it was to challenge fashion itself, and few dared to do so. The daily reality remained simple. Sweat soaked into undergarments. Odor were hidden under perfume, and stains were disguised with decoration. Gowns were admired in public, while their filth multiplied in private. This was not a mistake of a few individuals. It was the common routine of millions of women, accepted without comment, repeated year after year. The elegant outer gown, therefore, was less a sign of refinement than a mask. Beneath its folds lay the proof of neglect, hidden carefully but known by those who lived within it. The very weight of the fabric pressed the truth deeper, ensuring it stayed out of sight. To look at a Victorian lady was to see an illusion. To imagine the inner layers was to confront reality. The hair that framed these women carried its own secret. Combs and powders replaced soap and water. What grew beneath the braids was worse than anyone wished to admit. The hair of Victorian women was celebrated as a crown of beauty. Thick curls, carefully pinned braids, and elaborate updo were considered marks of refinement. On the surface, hair appeared polished and majestic, often adorned with ribbons or jeweled combs. Yet behind this outward display was a practice that allowed filth to gather unnoticed. Hair was rarely washed with water. Instead, powders were scattered through the strands, meant to absorb oil and leave a matte appearance. These powders carried perfume, giving the impression of freshness while concealing the truth beneath. The process was simple but deceptive. A woman might lean over her table while a maid sprinkled scented starch or rice powder onto her scalp. The hair was then brushed lightly, enough to spread the powder, but not enough to disturb the carefully arranged style. The result looked elegant in the mirror. To outsiders, the woman appeared refined and well kept. In reality, the powder only covered the layer of oil and sweat that had been building for days. The scalp remained dirty, and the strands grew heavy with residue. It is almost ridiculous that what was praised as the height of feminine elegance was nothing more than greasy hair disguised with white dust. Water was avoided for hair just as it was for the skin. It was thought to be dangerous, able to weaken health or damage the strength of the strands. Soap was harsh, and rinsing was difficult in homes where baths were already rare. Instead, powders became the standard. They gave hair a fuller volume and carried a strong scent, both of which matched the ideals of the age. But along with the volume came a silent invitation for lice. The insects thrived in the warm, unwashed environment, feeding on the scalp while hidden beneath braids and pins. Once styled, hair was not undone for several days. Women often slept with their braids and buns still pinned, covering them with cloths to keep the style intact. This saved time in the morning, but trapped dirt and sweat against the scalp. Lice multiplied quickly in such conditions, their eggs clinging to strands while their bodies crawled freely beneath the layers. Combs were used each day to adjust the style, but these combs were rarely cleaned. Oil, skin flakes, and even the remains of crushed lice clung to the teeth of the comb, ready to be dragged back through the hair the next day. The idea of cleanliness did not extend to hygiene as we understand it today. To Victorians, clean hair meant hair that looked smooth, smelled perfumed, and stayed in place. Actual washing was an afterthought. A fashionable woman might go weeks without allowing water to touch her head. Instead, she relied on powders, combs, and perfume to maintain the illusion. If compared to modern habits, it would be like refusing to wash one's hair for a month, and only spraying dry shampoo and perfume each morning, all while pretending it was perfectly hygienic. The difference is that in Victorian England, no one questioned the practice. The burden fell heavily on servants who handled their mistress's hair. They brushed through strands heavy with oil and powder, dealing with the smell that clung to their own clothes and hands. Some maids were tasked with removing lice directly, using fingers or cloths to crush them, an unpleasant duty that was rarely spoken of. The wealthy could tolerate infestation as long as it remained hidden beneath polished hairstyles. Appearances outweighed comfort. Hair accessories contributed to the problem. Ribbons, combs, and jeweled pins were often reused for weeks without cleaning. They collected powder and sweat, then carried lice from one section of hair to another. Shared among sisters or within families, they spread infestation from head to head. Still, the accessories gleamed brightly, distracting from what lay beneath. The sight of a sparkling comb or a silk ribbon was enough to sustain the illusion of refinement. I cannot help but imagine the discomfort of lying down at night, scalp itching, hair heavy with dust, yet still believing this was the proper standard of beauty. Public gatherings magnified the issue in theatres, dance halls and parlour. Women sat shoulder to shoulder, their hair towering in elaborate shapes. The air smelled of perfume, powder and stale oils, but the crowd accepted it as fashionable. The reality of crawling lice was ignored, even though it was common knowledge. Those who whispered about infestations did so privately. To speak of it aloud risked insulting entire classes of women. Silence maintained dignity, even while heads itched beneath jewels and silk. Medical advice existed, but was faint. Some doctors recommended occasional washing with vinegar solutions, yet few women followed this advice. The inconvenience outweighed the potential benefits. A woman who let down her hair to wash it risked ruining her carefully managed appearance. In a world where appearance defined morality and worth, few were willing to take that risk. Washing remained rare, and life remained common. The contradiction was clear. A society obsessed with appearances tolerated filth beneath the surface. Women spent hours arranging curls, pinning braids, and adorning themselves with perfumes, while ignoring the insects thriving just out of sight. This was not a hidden shame, but a tolerated reality woven into daily life. The sight of a refined lady was at once a display of elegance and a reminder of the infestation hidden beneath. Victorian hair, like their gowns, carried the mark of contradiction. Outwardly, it stood for refinement, beauty, and discipline. Inwardly, it was unwashed, infested, and suffocating. The powders that were meant to maintain cleanliness created the perfect environment for lice to thrive. The combs that were meant to control style carried filth back into the hair each day. The more effort that went into appearances, the worse the hidden truth became. Women endured the discomfort, convinced that beauty demanded sacrifice. Hair that glittered in gaslight was often hair that had not touched water for weeks. The powders thickened, the scalp itched, and the lice multiplied. Yet society accepted this, praising the women who bore it with composure. The silence that surrounded the habit was a silence born of fear, pride, and tradition. It allowed the problem to persist, hidden behind perfume and pins, admired from afar, but unbearable up close. They did not question the lice, because to do so was to question the very standards of elegance. They only added more powder, more perfume, and more layers of denial, believing this would be enough. The truth, however, was crawling just beneath the surface, and it was only a matter of time before it demanded detention. Hair that looked polished in public was crawling underneath. The itching grew so unbearable that desperate measures were invented. Some women even pressed their heads over fire to burn the lice alive. The struggle against lice in Victorian hair often led to desperate solutions. Powder and perfume might hide the smell, but they did nothing to stop the crawling beneath the scalp. When the itching grew too strong and the insects multiplied, some women turned to fire. The belief was simple: heat could kill what powders could not. A fireplace always burning in the home became a tool for what they thought was hygiene. The sight of a woman bending close to the flames, her hair spread out as if to dry, was not uncommon. Servants sometimes held combs near the fire, warming the teeth before dragging them through thick braids, hoping the heat would destroy lice and eggs clinging to the strands. The method was crude and dangerous. Long hair, heavy with powder and oils, caught the heat quickly. The smell of singed strands, mixed with perfume and grease, filled the room with a sharp, choking odor. It is almost ridiculous that something presented as refined beauty ended with women roasting their own hair like meat over a flame. Yet this was seen as practical. In the absence of effective remedies, households accepted the risk. Some women believed it was the only way to keep infestations under control, especially when water was avoided at all costs. The process often left hair damaged. Split ends, burnt patches and broken braids were common results, but appearance still came first. Women preferred to endure a ruined section of hair rather than admit lice to others. The act of holding one's head near the fire was never spoken of in polite company, but it was a whispered reality. Servants noticed it most. They were ordered to prepare the hearth and hold tools close to the flames while breathing in the acrid mix of burning hair and perfume. The smell lingered long after. Rooms filled with the stench of smoke and charred oil. Curtains absorbed it, bedding carried it, and clothes held it for days. But the practice continued. Families believed the odor proved that lice had been killed. Some even thought the smell itself acted as protection, keeping future infestations away. The truth was less convincing. The hair burned easily, but lice often survived in the roots, safe from the brief wave of heat. Still, women repeated the ritual. Fear of lice outweighed fear of fire. A lady might lean dangerously close, her face reened by the heat, while servants prayed her hair would not burst into flames. Accidents were inevitable. There are reports of women losing large portions of their hair when flames caught too quickly. Some were left with bald patches, others with hairlines permanently altered. If compared to today, it would be like trying to sterilize a toothbrush by shoving it into a bonfire and being surprised when it melts. The absurdity is clear to us, but it was not a joke for those who lived it. Fireplaces themselves were hardly clean. Ash, soot and smoke clung to everything. To press hair into that environment meant dragging more filth back onto the scalp. Combs warmed in the flames often carried soot straight into the roots of the hair. The attempt at killing lice only added new layers of dirt. Yet this contradiction mattered little. In a world where lice were constant, any attempt at control was better than none. Some women turned the practice into a routine. On certain evenings when the house was quieter, they would sit by the fire, comb in hand, leaning forward again and again. Children sometimes watched, learning that such a scene was ordinary. Maids assisted, pulling sections of hair and running heated combs through them. What might look like grooming from afar was in reality a fight against invisible pests. The danger extended beyond the individual. In households where many women lived together, a fire accident could threaten the entire home. Hair caught easily and sparks traveled quickly. A single mistake could spread flames from head to curtains, from curtains to furniture, and soon to the whole house. Families knew this, but persisted. The shame of lice outweighed the fear of fire. Doctors occasionally warned against such methods, but their voices carried little weight. Without modern shampoos or effective lice treatments, women clung to tradition. Perfume and powders provided the illusion of cleanliness. Fire promised the illusion of control. Together, they defined the boundaries of Victorian hair care. For the women themselves, there seemed no other choice. They were trapped between appearance, fear, and limited remedies. I cannot help but picture the mixture of fear and determination in a woman's eyes as she leaned over the flames, knowing she might scorch herself, but convinced that this was better than admitting infestation. The story of burning hair over fireplaces reveals much about the contradictions of the era. It speaks of a society where science had little power against custom, where fear of shame outweighed fear of danger, and where appearances demanded sacrifices that bordered on self-destruction. It also reveals how women bore the burden silently. Their suffering was private, their solutions desperate, and their risks constant. Yet the outer illusion of refinement was never allowed to break. In the end, the method did little to change the reality. Lice thrived in homes, regardless of fire, powders, or perfume. The cycle of infestation and attempted eradication repeated endlessly. The women of Victorian society remained trapped, victims of fashion and fear, while the smell of singed hair haunted their homes. They believed this was refinement, but in truth it was desperation, dressed as dignity. The irony was hidden in plain sight, waiting to be remembered as one of the most bizarre practices of the age. Women leaned into fire, scorched their hair, and still carried lice in the roots. The more they tried to destroy it, the more the problem returned. Hair was left brittle, homes smelled of smoke, and the insects endured regardless. They were not defeated, only burned around the edges. The fire rituals were shocking, but what lay beneath the gowns was even more so. Women lived without what we now consider essential clothing. They accepted the absence of underwear as completely normal. What it caused beneath the fabric was more disturbing than lice in the hair. Victorian gowns were long, layered, and heavy, and under all that fabric, something surprising was missing. Women did not wear underwear in the way we imagine today. The idea of a closed garment beneath the dress was considered improper, even unnecessary. Instead, gowns stretched to the ankles and were stacked with multiple layers that acted as barriers against the eyes of strangers. This wall of cloth was thought to provide enough modesty and protection. To Victorians, the presence of underwear was almost redundant. The absence of underwear created consequences that were rarely acknowledged. With no barrier between the body and the fabric, sweat soaked directly into the layers of skirts and petticoats. Bodily fluids left marks on the inner garments, absorbed day after day, with no real way of being cleaned quickly. The gowns became heavy, not just from fabric, but from the accumulation of moisture and bacteria. It is almost comical that what was praised as modesty was in reality a direct invitation for filth to settle closer to the body. But to Victorian women, this was not a point of shame. It was the standard of respectability, and questioning it would have seemed absurd. The practice also reflected a misunderstanding of health. Without a layer of cloth to protect the skin, chafing was common. Rashes formed where fabric rubbed too tightly, and infections spread silently. Doctors occasionally warned of the risks, but society held firm. Underwear was linked to indecency, and so it remained rare. Women endured discomfort because appearance meant more than relief. As long as they appeared virtuous in public, the private cost was ignored. The design of gowns encouraged this pattern. Skirts reached to the floor and contained multiple layers, each trapping heat. Petticoats and sheaths pressed against the body, absorbing sweat that had no way to evaporate. Corsets tightened the midsection, further reducing ventilation. The result was a hot, damp environment where bacteria thrived. Still, women carried themselves with poise, the weight of the gown hiding the reality beneath. If compared to modern standards, it would be like walking through summer in a thick coat every day without a shirt underneath, convinced that nobody would notice the discomfort or the smell. The absurdity is plain to us, but it was accepted without question at the time. This lack of underwear was also a matter of practicality. Gowns were difficult to manage. Adding more layers of clothing beneath would have made dressing even slower and more complex. Instead, women chose what seemed easiest. They believed the bulk of the fabric was protection enough. What mattered most was avoiding scandal, not ensuring hygiene. The long skirt itself was considered a shield, a defense against exposure. What lay underneath was never supposed to be discussed. Servants who laundered clothing noticed the truth most clearly. They handled gowns stained and heavy with sweat, lifting fabrics that clung together from dampness. The task of cleaning was nearly impossible. Without underwear to catch the first layer of dirt, every garment carried the full burden. Washing such heavy material took hours, sometimes days, and often the dirt was only smeared rather than removed. For poorer women who could not afford frequent cleaning, the problem grew worse. Gowns became breeding grounds for bacteria, yet they continued to be worn with pride. I cannot help but feel unsettled when I think of these women, admired in public as models of virtue, while knowing that beneath the fabric their bodies were constantly pressed against unwashed cloth. The social meaning of this absence was powerful. It became part of the moral code of the age. Underwear, as we understand it, was linked to sexuality, and therefore rejected to where none at all was considered purer, cleaner in the moral sense, even if not in the physical sense. This contradiction defined much of Victorian life. What mattered was the outward appearance of virtue, not the hidden truth of hygiene. The discomfort was constant, heat built beneath the layers, sweat accumulated, and yet nothing changed. Women tolerated it, convinced that this was the price of respectability. Husbands, doctors, and servants knew the truth, but no one openly challenged it. The silence that surrounded the practice was stronger than the evidence of smell, stains, or illness. It was a silence that protected appearances while allowing suffering to continue. The absence of underwear also influenced how women moved. Long skirts limited their steps, and without protection beneath, they had to be even more careful in how they sat, walked, or bent. Every movement was restricted, dictated not only by fashion, but also by the risk of revealing too much. This added another layer of discomfort to daily life. Yet still, the gowns were worn proudly, and the tradition endured. For poorer women, the problem was harsher. They had fewer gowns to rotate and could not afford frequent cleaning. Sweat, dirt, and stains lingered far longer, sometimes until the fabric itself wore out. Their reality was one of constant contact with unwashed cloth, a cycle of discomfort that never truly ended. The wealthy might have had more fabric and more perfume, but the basic truth remained the same. Beneath every gown, the body pressed directly against layers that never received proper care. The contradiction between appearance and reality was once again exposed. To look at a Victorian woman was to see modesty and refinement. To imagine the unseen was to recognize neglect and decay. What was praised as pure and proper was in truth unsanitary and harmful. But society valued modesty above hygiene, and so the practice continued day after day, year after year. The gowns appeared elegant, but beneath them the truth was unavoidable. Sweat clung to fabric. Bacteria thrived, and discomfort was endured in silence. Women accepted this reality as normal, convinced it was necessary for respectability. They may have carried themselves with grace in public, but their private suffering told another story. The absence of underwear, far from being a sign of purity, was one of the many contradictions of the era. They believed modesty required sacrifice, even when that sacrifice was their own comfort and health. Gowns dragged along the ground, while the skin pressed directly into the fabric. The result was dirtier than anyone admitted, and what women placed on their faces each morning made the situation even more dangerous. Each morning in Victorian households, many women sat before mirrors and prepared their faces not with creams that nourished the skin, but with powders made from poison. White powder containing lead or sometimes arsenic was spread evenly across the face, down the neck, and in some cases even along the arms to keep the skin the same shade. To appear pale was to appear refined, free from the marks of labor and sunlight. The pale surface stood as a sign of status. And so the ritual continued each day. The powder had an immediate effect. It lightened the skin and gave the illusion of smoothness. Cracks, spots, and blemishes disappeared beneath the chalky layer. For a few hours, the woman looked as society expected, delicate, untouchable, and elegant. But the truth beneath was different. The powder did not heal or protect. It seeped into pores, irritated the skin, and carried toxins into the body. It is almost absurd that what was praised as elegance was in fact the steady poisoning of one's own face. Yet in Victorian culture, this was not questioned. The white mask was praised and the suffering it caused was ignored. The effects were visible quickly. Skin became dry, red and flaky. Some women developed rashes that spread across their faces. Others suffered from painful peeling or sores that never fully healed. But rather than abandon the practice, they applied more powder to cover the damage. The cycle repeated itself. The skin grew worse. The need for powder grew stronger, and the poison continued to sink deeper. To many, this was considered normal. Beauty required sacrifice. Redness and itching were dismissed as small inconveniences compared to the risk of appearing unfashionable. Even servants who saw the damage up close said nothing, for their role was to assist, not to criticize. Women endured the pain silently, convinced that the white face they presented to society was worth the hidden suffering. Arsenic and lead powders were not rare luxuries. They were widely sold, available in shops and from traveling sellers. Some recipes were passed down in families, mixtures of chalk, vinegar and metals. Perfume was added to mask the smell, giving the illusion that these powders were gentle. They were applied with soft cloths or brushes, creating a ritual that felt refined even as it spread toxins onto the skin. If compared to today, it would be like rubbing industrial paint onto the face each morning, calling it skincare, and convincing oneself that the pain was a sign of effectiveness. The practice appears shocking now, but then it was considered a mark of class. The obsession with the whiteness of skin ran deep. Pale complexions were linked to virtue, while tan skin was associated with labor and poverty. A woman who wanted to be seen as respectable had little choice but to maintain this artificial whiteness. Even when her health suffered, she clung to the mask. Society's judgment weighed heavily than personal comfort. The pale face was a silent requirement of status. The long-term consequences were devastating. Chronic poisoning led to hair loss, tooth decay, and weakness of the body. Some women experienced trembling hands or failing eyesight, yet even these signs were explained away as natural fragility rather than as symptoms of daily exposure to poison. Doctors occasionally raised concerns, but without modern understanding or regulations. Their warnings went unheard. The powders remained on shelves, and women continued to buy them. I cannot help but feel unsettled when I think of these women smiling politely at gatherings, their faces painted with toxins, their skin beneath burning and peeling, yet none of them daring to admit the truth. The irony deepens when one considers the culture of morality that surrounded these women. They were expected to embody purity and refinement, yet their daily rituals quietly destroyed their own health. The powders symbolized elegance to society, but marked decay in private. What was admired from afar was suffering up close, and still the practice remained widespread, unchallenged by those who benefited from selling it. In households across cities and towns, the morning scene repeated itself. A mirror, a cloth, a pot of white powder, and the steady hand of a woman determined to maintain her place in society. She ignored the stinging of her skin, the flakes falling on her dress, and the quiet fear that the damage was permanent. All that mattered was the pale surface reflected back at her. In this, she was not alone. It was the shared fate of countless women, bound by the same expectation, trapped by the same standard. The ritual of daily whitening powder stands today as one of the starkest contradictions of Victorian life. It shows how deeply appearance could outweigh reason, how the demand for refinement led women to harm themselves each day. It also reveals the silence that surrounded such habits. Everyone saw the effects, yet no one questioned them. The mask of whiteness was maintained no matter the cost beneath. Women smiled through burning skin, believing that pain was simply part of being proper. Powder gave them faces that looked smooth and pale, beneath skin cracked and burned with every layer, and what they placed under their pillows at night was even stranger than the powders they wore by day. In the bedrooms of Victorian women, the night carried its own strange rituals. Before sleeping, some would place an onion, or at times the peel of an orange, near their faces. They believed the smell would draw out foul odor from the mouth and purify the breath during the night. To them, this seemed like a natural form of protection, a way to cleanse without effort. The onion or peel sat on the pillow or beneath it, a quiet guardian against bad air. When morning came, the object was discarded, and the cycle began again. The belief in such remedies reflected the mistrust of modern hygiene. Toothbrushes were rare, and only a small number of women owned them. Even then, brushes were crude and often made from pig bristles that wore down quickly. For most households, there was no daily brushing, no toothpaste, and no fresh rinse of water. Instead, improvised remedies filled the gap. The onion, the citrus peel, and occasionally dried herbs were pressed into service. They were simple, available, and considered safe. It is almost comical that a society that valued refinement so highly accepted a stinking onion as a tool of elegance. Yet this was considered not only acceptable, but sensible. Morning routines are built on these nightly practices. Women chewed dried bark, flowers or small pieces of herbs to mask their breath. Mint, clove, or rose petals were sometimes chosen, but availability varied. The effort was not about removing bacteria or cleaning teeth. It was about masking smell, presenting a surface of respectability, while the reality beneath remained untouched. A mouth rinsed with vinegar or wiped with a cloth was deemed sufficient. The appearance of freshness mattered far more than actual hygiene. Toothbrushes existed, but they were seen as luxuries. Those who could afford them did not always use them properly. Brushes were shared within families, passed from hand to hand, and sometimes unwashed. They sat on bedroom tables or near chamber pots, collecting dust and mold. The majority of women, however, never touched one. For them, cloth and salt replaced bristles and paste. A rag dipped in salt was rubbed along the gums, an act more symbolic than effective. If compared to today, it would be like wiping the mouth with a napkin dipped in kitchen seasoning and calling it dental care. The thought is unsettling now, but then it was common. Decay followed, teeth blackened, breath grew foul, and gums swelled with disease. Yet in portraits and gatherings, women smiled through it, convinced that perfumes and surface rituals hid the truth. Servants and family members tolerated the odor as part of life. Disease of the mouth was accepted as inevitable, another burden of the body. To treat it with seriousness was beyond the imagination of many. The cultural silence was telling. Hygiene of the mouth was not a subject for polite discussion. To speak of it openly was considered crude. Instead, improvised practices were passed quietly between women, whispered as tips or inherited as family traditions. The onion beneath the pillow, the peel at the bedside, or the cloth dipped in salt. All of these became habits that were repeated without question. I find it disturbing to imagine a household filled with the sharp stench of onions at night, a smell everyone accepted while believing it kept them refined. The larger context cannot be ignored. Cities were already filled with odor of cold smoke, manure, and stagnant water. Against this backdrop, the personal smell of breath was perhaps less striking. To mask it with herbs or onions seemed sufficient. The illusion of freshness did not need to be perfect, only enough to maintain appearances in social settings. The long-term effects were hidden behind these habits. Women lost teeth young, suffered from constant infections, and endured pain silently. Dentists existed, but were expensive and often feared. Extraction was the most common treatment, carried out with crude tools and little care for comfort. Preventive care was almost unheard of. Instead, the onion under the pillow remained the gentle, familiar option, a strange comfort in a world of decay. Even the wealthiest homes repeated these rituals. Expensive powders and perfumes could hide the worst smells, but the underlying neglect remained. The onion, humble and cheap, bridged the gap between classes. Both poor and rich relied on it in some form, convinced that nature itself provided protection. The truth, however, was far different. In the quiet of the night, beds filled with the pungent scent of onion and citrus. Women lay their heads close, breathing in what they believed was a cure. The morning after, they chewed flowers, bark or herbs, repeating the cycle once more. There was no true cleansing, only the constant shifting of smells from one form to another. What mattered was not health, but the illusion of care. The pillow-hidden onion, the mouth-chewed bark, and the cloth rubbed salt along the gums. The result was decay dressed as refinement. And the strangest of all were the secret recipes that used something far more personal than onions or herbs. Among the strangest of Victorian beauty practices was one that relied not on powders, perfumes or herbs, but on the body itself. In the quiet of the morning, some women collected their own urine and used it to wash their faces. They believed that the first urine of the day carried special cleansing properties, able to brighten the skin and keep blemishes away. To them, this was not shocking but practical. It was passed down as an inherited recipe, whispered in families, repeated by mothers to daughters, and justified as a secret of refinement. The act was not confined to the poor or the desperate, even among the upper classes. The idea of urine as a cleanser held weight. Aristocratic women spoke of it as a household cure, a private remedy that needed no shopkeeper and cost nothing. It is almost ridiculous that the same women who wore diamonds and lace believed the liquid from their own bodies was the key to elegance. Yet they accepted it. Each morning, with careful hands, they wiped their faces with cloths dampened by urine, letting the sharp smell linger as the liquid dried into their skin. The belief rested on the idea of purity. Urine, leaving the body clear and warm in the early morning, was imagined to carry away imperfections. The skin treated daily was supposed to appear smoother and brighter. The truth was less graceful. The ammonia and compounds in the liquid irritated the skin, leaving redness and dryness. Women accepted this as part of the process, convincing themselves that stinging was proof of success. In reality, they were rubbing waste into their pores. For those who practiced it, secrecy was important. It was rarely spoken of outside the home. Servants sometimes discovered the habit, ordered to launder cloths that carried the smell, but they stayed silent. To expose such practices risked disgrace. The families involved carried on as if nothing were unusual, presenting a polished appearance in public while clinging to these hidden rituals in private. The silence helped the habit survive for generations. Morning routines varied, but urine was often followed by layers of powder and perfume. The smell that clung to the skin was covered by rosewater or heavy floral scents. By the time a woman stepped into society, no trace of the ritual was supposed to remain. Only those closest to her might notice the faint odor beneath the perfume. Yet, even if they did, they pretended otherwise. The rules of propriety demanded silence above all. The presence of urine in beauty practices was not unique to England. Across Europe, folk traditions had long claimed its value as a cleanser. In Victorian times, these older beliefs were mixed with the obsession for pale skin. Women looked for any method to keep their complexion smooth, and urine was cheap, available, and easily justified as natural. If compared to today, it would be like skipping expensive cosmetics, and instead rubbing household waste on the face each morning, insisting it was the secret to beauty. The absurdity is clear to us, but not to them. The persistence of this custom shows how tightly appearances gripped the culture. A woman might endure the smell, the irritation, and the secrecy because the reward was social approval. To be pale and clear-skinned was to be admired. To fall outside of that standard was to risk whispers and judgment. The lengths women went to, including rubbing their faces with urine, reveal the desperation tied to beauty in this age. The physical effects grew worse over time. Skin broke into sores, peeled in patches, or developed a constant redness. But rather than see these as signs of damage, women saw them as reasons to continue. More treatment seemed necessary, not less. The cycle repeated daily, locking them into a routine that destroyed as much as it promised. I cannot help but imagine the discomfort of a woman smiling in a crowded room, her skin burning faintly under powder, while knowing that the morning had begun with the sting of urine on her face. Servants and lower-caste women also copied the custom when they learned of it. For them, it carried an appeal: no cost, no shops, no need for scarce powders. Urine was the one resource always at hand. What began in whispers of the aristocracy trickled down, spreading across classes as an accepted but hidden tradition. Silence kept it alive, and shame kept it unspoken. This practice fit perfectly within the wider contradictions of Victorian hygiene. The same society that built ornate parlours and dressed in endless layers tolerated habits that would now be unthinkable. Beneath the polished exterior, women rubbed waste on their faces and called it refinement. They believed the smell could be masked, the truth concealed, and the illusion maintained. The reality was left to rot behind the curtain of appearance. The morning urine ritual was not spoken of openly, but its presence lingered across households. It reveals more than just an odd custom. It shows how the fear of blemish and the pursuit of status could drive people to embrace what seems revolting. It also shows how silence allowed the practice to persist, unchallenged and unacknowledged, hidden beneath perfume and powder, protected by the rules of modesty. Faces were rubbed with what the body expelled. Perfume disguised the odor but not the truth. And the next unspoken secret was even more painful, hidden in the silence surrounding women's monthly lives. In Victorian society, menstruation was one of the most silent subjects. Women lived through it each month, yet few dared to speak of it openly. The idea of discussing bodily cycles was considered shameful, unladylike, and unfit for polite company. Even within families, the matter was passed in whispers, if it was acknowledged at all. The silence was so strong that many young girls entered their first cycle without clear guidance, relying only on hurried instructions or improvised habits. What was natural was treated as forbidden, and the cost of that silence fell entirely on women. The methods of managing menstruation were basic and hidden. Most women used small strips of cotton cloth, folded and pinned in place. These pieces were washed in separate buckets away from the eyes of men or even other women in the household. After washing, they were dried in dark corners or private rooms where no one would see them. Sunlight and air, which might have kept the clothes clean, were avoided out of shame. As a result, the fabric often stayed damp, carrying bacteria that easily led to infection. It is almost absurd that a society which obsessed over morality forced women to handle their health in secret corners, as if cleanliness itself were a crime. The risks were clear even then. Rashes, irritation, and severe infection spread among women who had no safe way to manage their cycles. Doctors rarely addressed these issues, and when they did, they wrapped their advice in vague language that avoided the reality of menstruation. The subject was seen as too indecent to appear in medical texts or newspapers. Women suffered quietly, treating their pain as an unspoken duty. Infections that might have been prevented with simple hygiene became lifelong conditions. The burden fell heavily on servants. When stains appeared on gowns, it was often the maid who noticed first. A mark on an outer skirt could bring punishment, not sympathy. Mistresses sometimes blamed their servants for failing to observe such details, as if a maid should have prevented the inevitable. The stain itself was treated as a moral failure rather than a biological fact. This harshness reveals how little understanding or compassion surrounded the subject. Improvised practices were common. Some women folded rags from old garments, while others used layers of linen tucked awkwardly into their gowns. Because laundering was so difficult, these rags were reused repeatedly, often without proper drying or disinfecting. Infections of the reproductive tract became widespread, yet no one dared to link them to the hidden cloths. If compared to today, it would be like forcing half the population to reuse dirty handkerchiefs for weeks, while forbidding them to even mention why. The cruelty lay not only in the lack of resources, but in the enforced silence. The silence extended beyond the home. Shops did not advertise or openly sell products for women's cycles. To ask for such things in public would have been scandalous. As a result, women relied on private networks, passing down advice quietly, each generation inheriting the same limited practices. What should have been a matter of health remained a matter of shame. The psychological weight was as damaging as the physical. Women carried the fear of being exposed. A single stain on a gown could bring humiliation. Even within families, men were rarely told the truth. Husbands might notice their wives' discomfort, but never speak of it. Daughters learned early to keep silent, to conceal their struggles as proof of modesty. I cannot help but feel troubled when I imagine these women forced to smile at gatherings while hiding pain that society refused to acknowledge. The cultural expectation of silence created a cycle of ignorance. Without open discussion, women had little access to alternatives. Innovations in hygiene developed slowly because no one would demand them. Pain and infection were endured as ordinary. Even though they were preventable, the insistence on silence did not protect women's dignity. It stripped them of care, comfort, and progress. In wealthier households, the situation was no better. Even when resources existed, the stigma remained. Servants washed and hid cloths discreetly, ensuring that no trace appeared to visitors. Women of status endured the same infections as their poorer counterparts. Proof that shame recognized no class boundaries. The gowns of both rich and poor carried the same risks, the same silence, and the same hidden suffering. The contradiction between public morality and private reality was stark. Victorian society prided itself on discipline and purity. Yet it forced women to handle menstruation in the least sanitary way possible. The silence protected the illusion of propriety while damaging the very women it was supposed to uphold. What could have been solved with simple openness became a lifelong burden wrapped in secrecy. Behind lace and silk, women reused damp cloths, endured pain, and feared discovery. Stains brought punishment, infections spread, and silence continued. They accepted this as part of womanhood, because to resist would mean breaking rules written by society itself. The result was generations of women who lived with suffering that could not even be spoken aloud. The clothes were hidden, the stains punished, and the pain ignored. Beneath the silence, infections grew worse, and the same silence surrounded how women cared for their hands and mouths with habits that carried their own dangers. Victorian daily life looked polished on the surface, but many of the habits that passed as hygiene were anything but clean. A striking example was the reliance on handkerchiefs in place of washing. For women in this period, carrying clothes was not just a matter of fashion elegance. It was their main tool for wiping, drying, and pretending that care had been taken of the body. Hand washing with soap and water was rare, avoided for reasons of convenience, cost, and superstition. The result was that pieces of fabric folded carefully in a pocket or handbag became substitutes for proper hygiene. They were pressed to the lips after meals, dabbed against sweat on the forehead, and even used for wiping private areas. Once folded, they were tucked away until the next use without being washed in between. This practice was so common that to Victorians it hardly seemed unusual. The handkerchief was often presented as a mark of refinement. Ladies displayed embroidered cloths with initials or lace edges, pulling them out in company with a graceful movement. The gesture was admired as polite and proper, but no one commented on the fact that the same cloth might have been used earlier in the day for far less refined purposes. Cleanliness was measured by appearance rather than by fact. A neatly folded handkerchief suggested order, even if it was stiff with stains. It is almost laughable that people convinced themselves that a perfumed rag could carry the weight of personal hygiene. Yet it was accepted across all levels of society, from the wealthy to the poor. Perfume made this illusion easier to maintain. Bottles of strong floral scent were kept on dressing tables and in handbags. Women sprinkled their handkerchiefs liberally to disguise the odor of repeated use. The clothes often carried a heavy mix of rose water, lavender, and other oils layered over the underlying smell of sweat, saliva, and waste. To the nose of others, the perfume was overpowering. To the women themselves, it was reassurance that no one would notice what lay beneath. The handkerchief became both a mask and a shield, giving the impression of care while hiding neglect. Multiple cloths were sometimes carried at once. A woman of means might keep 2 or 3 in her bag or sleeves, switching between them depending on the situation. One might be used for the face, another for the mouth, and a third for other purposes. But switching did not mean washing. All of them were reused for days, sometimes for a whole week before being cleaned. In poorer households, women often had only 1 or 2, which were used until they became stiff from dirt. If compared to the present, it would be like using one tissue repeatedly for your face, hands, and body all week long, and still believing this was proof of refinement. The comparison reveals the absurdity that Victorians accepted as ordinary. The health risks were obvious even then, though rarely acknowledged. A damp cloth pressed repeatedly against the mouth carried bacteria back into the skin. Clothes used on intimate areas spread infections easily without proper washing. Microbes multiply quickly in the warm, scented fabric. Women developed rashes, skin irritations, and more serious infections. But these were explained away as natural weaknesses of the body. Few made the connection to the handkerchiefs they carried so proudly. Doctors, bound by the culture of silence, rarely spoke openly about such habits. Hygiene as a subject was itself considered indelicate. Servants bore the hardest part of this cycle. They collected the clothes for washing, soaking them in basins filled with water that quickly turned foul. They rubbed at stains with soap that smelled of animal fat, breathing in the mixed stench of perfume and rot. Yet they had little choice but to treat the clothes as delicate property. Embroidery and lace were protected even as filth clung to them. The servants' awareness of what the clothes had been used for was never mentioned. Silence preserved the illusion of refinement. I cannot help but feel uneasy when I imagine a maid standing over a basin of foul-smelling water, scrubbing a cloth that her mistress waved proudly in public the very next day. The contradiction between appearance and reality was sharp. To be seen with a handkerchief was a mark of manners, a symbol of elegance. To be without one was considered coarse or careless. Yet the object itself was one of the dirtiest possessions a woman carried. Each day added new layers of contamination, and each night ended with the same cloth tucked neatly away for the morning. Perfume and embroidery turned filth into fashion. Even within wealthier circles the problem persisted. Owning more clothes did not mean they were cleaned more often. It simply meant there was more to rotate. A drawer full of perfumed fabric gave the impression of abundance, but all of them were handled in the same way. The poor with fewer clothes endured worse, but the habit stretched across classes. The belief that cloth could replace water united women of every background. The persistence of this practice reveals the wider Victorian attitude toward hygiene. Appearances mattered far more than facts. Washing with soap and water was distrusted, sometimes seen as dangerous, while carrying a handkerchief was praised as proper. The culture valued modest gestures over practical health. A woman might be praised for dabbing delicately at her lips in public, even as she pressed the same cloth to her body in private. The illusion of care mattered more than care itself. This reliance on handkerchiefs also shows how social rules overpowered practicality. A woman who rejected the practice might have been seen as strange or improper. Everyone followed the same pattern because everyone feared standing out. It was easier to carry a perfume cloth and share the illusion than to break the silence and risk judgment. As with many Victorian habits, the pressure of society kept the cycle alive. The story of the handkerchief is therefore not only about fabric and perfume, it is about the way a culture chose illusion over truth. It is about how people clung to objects that symbolized elegance even as they carried disease. It is about the silence that allowed these contradictions to persist unchallenged until hygiene finally changed in later generations. But in the height of Victorian life, the handkerchief remained central, an accessory that hid as much as it revealed. Cloths were wiped on faces, mouths, and private areas before being folded neatly again. Perfume disguised their stench, while embroidery disguised their stains. They were accepted as marks of elegance, even while carrying filth. And what came next in the routine was no cleaner, for even the soap that was supposed to cleanse the body was itself a source of stench and discomfort. Victorian women lived in a world where daily hygiene was shaped as much by superstition and custom as by the availability of products. One of the clearest examples was the soap they used. The most common variety was made from animal fat mixed with ash, a coarse and greasy substance that produced a strong, rancid smell. To modernize, this might hardly qualify as soap at all. It foamed poorly, left a residue on the skin, and filled the air with a scent that many compared to burning meat. Yet for most households, this was the only affordable option. To buy more refined soap required wealth, and even then the difference was only slight. Women across the social scale were faced with the same dilemma: endure the stench or abandon soap altogether. The process of making this soap explains why it was so unpleasant. Animal fat was collected from kitchens and butchers, boiled with ashes until it hardened into crude blocks. The smell of this mixture clung to the finished product. Once water was added, the odor only intensified. Washing with such soap did not create a sense of freshness. Instead, it left behind the acrid memory of fire and decay. It is almost comical that a society that prized refinement so highly accepted a soap that made its users smell worse after cleaning. But with few alternatives, women used it anyway, holding their breath and scrubbing quickly. For many, the irritation was worse than the smell. The rough composition of the soap stripped natural oils from the skin, leaving dryness and painful cracks. Sensitive skin reacted with burning sensations, redness, and rashes. Some women tried it once or twice and decided never to use it again. In their view, soap was not an aid to beauty, but an assault to protect their complexions. They abandoned it entirely, replacing it with powders or starches that gave the illusion of cleanliness without the pain. In this way, the very product meant to clean pushed people toward alternatives that did nothing at all. Those alternatives became the daily routine of many. Rice powder was popular, dusted lightly over the face to give a matte surface. Scented powders were used in place of washing, leaving behind a smell of flowers that masked sweat and oil. To outsiders, this looked like refinement. To those living in it, it was a necessity. The use of powder avoided the stench of soap and the damage it inflicted, but it also meant that skin was rarely cleansed in any meaningful way. Dirt and bacteria built up under the fine white dust, clogging pores and feeding infections. If compared to the present, it would be like replacing a shower with a spray of deodorant and talcum powder every day, then convincing yourself that the body was truly clean. The absurdity is plain, but for Victorians it was normal. The avoidance of soap spread beyond individual preference. In polite society, women sometimes justified their choice by claiming that frequent washing was unladylike. To scrub too often was considered coarse, something servants did after hard labor. A lady was expected to appear clean without admitting to the physical work of washing. Thus, refusing to use soap could even be framed as an act of refinement. Dirt was managed with perfumes, powders and fabrics, rather than with water and harsh blocks of fat. The illusion was preserved, while the body beneath suffered. The poor could not even pretend. For them, the cheap soap was all that existed. Laundresses, maids and factory women scrubbed with it daily, their hands left raw and red. They endured the burning because they had no choice. Their work required constant contact with dirt and grease and soap. However unpleasant, was still necessary. The cracks on their fingers, the redness on their cheeks, and the smell that clung to their clothes told the truth of what it cost. The rich avoided soap out of choice. The poor endured it out of survival. Servants in wealthy homes also handled this soap constantly. They washed linens, scrubbed floors, and cleaned dishes with it, all while inhaling the rancid odor. Their mistresses might have avoided the block for their own faces, but they benefited from the labor of those who did not. The servants bore the discomfort, while the ladies powdered their cheeks and sprayed perfume, pretending that refinement had no price. I cannot help but think of the double standard here, where the very same households that sneered at the smell of soap demanded that their servants use it endlessly on clothes, dishes, and furniture. Medical advice offered little relief. Some doctors encouraged washing with soap, believing it prevented disease. Others warned against it, claiming the harshness could harm women's delicate skin. With no clear guidance, the public formed its own rules. The result was inconsistency. Some avoided soap entirely, while others used it sparingly, treating it as a necessary evil rather than a daily tool. Hygiene became a matter of appearances, shaped by fashion more than by health. This distrust of soap reveals how far Victorian standards were from modern ones. Today, soap is expected to smell pleasant, to soothe the skin, and to be used daily without question. In the 19th century, it was a burden, endured reluctantly and avoided whenever possible. Women turned to powders, perfumes, and improvised methods rather than face the smell and sting of soap. The irony is clear in avoiding the discomfort. They also avoided true cleanliness. The persistence of such habits shows how powerfully culture can override practicality. Even when evidence of infection and irritation was obvious, people clung to traditions. Women protected their skin from the burning soap by refusing to wash, then covered the consequences with powder. Society applauded the pale, powdered face without questioning what lay beneath. Health was sacrificed to appearance, as it was in so many areas of Victorian life. In homes across England, the same scene repeated itself. A bar of foul-smelling soap sat untouched on the shelf. A jar of powder stood close by, used daily to dust away shine and odor. The soap, meant to symbolize cleanliness, became a symbol of something else entirely, a reminder of discomfort, avoided whenever possible. It lingered in the background, a product to be endured only when absolutely necessary. Women lived in contradiction every day. They powdered their faces, sprayed perfume, and carried handkerchiefs, all to mask the absence of true washing. Soap was present but unwelcome, a product they owned but preferred not to use. This strange balance defined Victorian hygiene: possession without practice, appearance without reality. The soap block lay waiting, its rancid smell filling the air, while life carried on around it as though it did not exist. The rancid block sat on shelves, ignored by women who chose powders instead. The smell of fat and ash spread through homes, but was disguised with perfume. And the next household item that claimed to clean was even worse, for toothbrushes themselves carried mold, filth and disease. Victorian hygiene extended beyond the body to the tools they used, and few objects reveal the contradictions of the time more clearly than the toothbrush. What seems to us like a basic instrument of cleanliness was in their world a crude, unsanitary piece of wood with coarse bristles made from pig hair. These brushes were often poorly crafted, shedding bristles into the mouth or scraping against the gums until they bled. They were used not with modern toothpaste, but with powders made from chalk, salt, or even crushed brick. Cleaning with such a tool was more about going through the motions than about achieving real hygiene. After each use, the brush was set aside without being rinsed thoroughly. The damp bristles quickly collected residue from the mouth. Food particles, saliva and chalk stuck together, forming clumps that hardened between the pig hairs left in dark and damp bedrooms. The brushes soon developed mold. Green and black spots appeared, creeping along the base of the bristles. But this was accepted as normal. To Victorians, it was simply the way things were. It is almost absurd that an object meant to clean the mouth became a breeding ground for decay. Sharing brushes was also common. A single brush might be passed between family members, sometimes between parents and children, sometimes even between guests in a household. The concept of personal hygiene did not extend to personal tools. One brush stood for the whole family, stored in a shared dish or left on a shelf near the washstand. Illness spread easily, though few recognized the connection. Colds, mouth infections and other diseases traveled from one person to the next through the very tool meant to prevent them. Storage habits worsened the problem. Bathrooms, as we know them, did not exist in most homes, so toothbrushes were often kept in bedrooms. Chamber pots sat nearby, sometimes just inches from where brushes were placed. The air carried odor of waste, and in some cases brushes rested directly beside toilets or within arm's reach of the pot. The association of cleanliness and filth in such close quarters was striking, if compared to modern standards. It would be like keeping a toothbrush next to a garbage bin and never washing it, then still believing it represented good hygiene. Yet this was considered ordinary in Victorian households. For those who used them, brushing was not even a daily activity. Some brushed only before social gatherings, relying on chewing herbs or rinsing with vinegar for regular days. The toothbrush was more a symbol of effort than a daily tool. To own one suggested refinement, even if it was covered in mold. In poorer families, few owned such tools at all. Cloth, salt or bark served as substitutes, rubbed quickly across the teeth to mask odor rather than to clean. Dentists of the era occasionally raised concerns about poor practices, but their advice rarely reached the majority. Even when warnings appeared in newspapers, they were drowned out by tradition. Families clung to their habits, unwilling to throw away brushes or to question practices passed down through generations. Moldy bristles remained in use day after day, passed between mouths, accepted in silence. I cannot help but feel unsettled when I imagine a family lined up in the morning, each taking the same brush in turn, pressing it into their mouths without a thought. Wealthier women sometimes tried to mask the problem with perfume. They sprayed the handles of their brushes or wiped them with scented cloths, convincing themselves that the smell of lavender or rose meant cleanliness. Of course, the bristles themselves remained untouched, harboring the same mold and residue. The gesture was one of appearance, not effectiveness. This pattern repeated across many areas of Victorian hygiene illusion valued over truth. Even when brushes wore down, they were rarely discarded. Pig bristles loosened and fell out, leaving gaps that made cleaning even less effective. Still, the brush was kept, sometimes for years, until it fell apart completely. In families where money was tight, broken brushes were tied together or old bristles were pressed into new handles. The result was a tool that looked serviceable, but carried years of accumulated filth. The contradiction between belief and reality defined this practice. To own a toothbrush was to suggest modernity and refinement. To use it was to join a small minority who seemed to take hygiene seriously. But in practice, the tool carried more disease than it prevented. It was a mark of progress that in reality pulled people backward. Morning routines across Victorian households repeated this cycle. A chalk powder, a pig bristle brush, a few quick strokes, and then the brush is left to rot until the next use. Mold grew, bristles fell out, and diseases spread. But none of this was acknowledged. What mattered was that the action had been performed. Cleanliness was assumed, even when decay sat plainly on the tool itself. The toothbrushes sat in bedrooms near chamber pots, damp and unwashed. They were shared between mouths, used until they broke apart and covered in mold that no one questioned, and what surrounded them was no cleaner, for the very rooms that held these tools were thick with dust, fabric, and the smell of decay. Victorian households liked to present themselves as models of refinement, and nowhere was this more visible than in the bedroom. Wealthy families spent fortunes on heavy curtains, thick carpets, ornate bedding, and layers of fabric designed to show elegance and comfort. On the surface, these rooms looked impressive, full of velvet drapes and polished furniture, but beneath the appearance of grandeur lay filth. The very materials chosen to display wealth were the ones that trapped dust, held moisture, and created perfect breeding grounds for mold and bacteria. These bedrooms, meant to symbolize status, became some of the dirtiest spaces in the home. The curtains were often made of velvet or other dense fabrics. Their weight gave them a grand appearance, cascading from high ceilings to the floor in thick folds. They darkened the rooms, filtering sunlight and giving an air of privacy and calm. Yet those folds collected dust day after day, rarely if ever cleaned. Each time the fabric moved, small clouds of fine particles rose into the air. Without regular washing, the curtains turned into reservoirs of dirt. It is almost absurd that families spent large sums on velvet drapes, only to let them rot slowly, with dust and insects hidden inside. But the look of wealth mattered more than the reality of hygiene. The beds were no better. Feather mattresses were prized for their softness, filled with layers of down or feathers packed tightly together. They seemed luxurious, offering a deep surface to sink into after a long day. Yet these mattresses were rarely aired or washed. Feathers absorbed sweat and moisture, and over time they smelled strongly of decay. Bedbugs thrived inside them, feeding at night while women slept under thick blankets. The problem was well known but often ignored. Replacing a mattress was expensive, and to be infested was considered shameful. So families endured, convinced that the appearance of a fine bed outweighed the discomfort it caused. Carpets added to the problem. Victorian floors were often covered in thick rugs or wall-to-wall carpeting designed to reduce drafts and add warmth. But these heavy fabrics trapped dirt brought in from outside. Cold dust from fireplaces, ash from candles, and mud from shoes collected in the fibers. Cleaning them required enormous effort. Vacuum cleaners did not exist, and even sweeping only stirred the dirt higher into the air. As a result, carpets were washed infrequently, sometimes only once a year. By then, they carried years of accumulated filth, giving the rooms a constant musty smell. If compared to today, it would be like carpeting a room and never cleaning it for years, then acting surprised when the air became heavy with dust. Windows, too, contributed to the filth. Many households believed that fresh air was dangerous, carrying miasmas that caused disease. Because of this superstition, windows were kept closed most of the time. Curtains remained drawn, keeping out both light and airflow. Without circulation, moisture from breathing, washing, and even sweating lingered in the room. The result was damp walls, mold creeping in corners, and an ever-present smell of mildew. This was not hidden. Anyone stepping into such a bedroom would have noticed the odor immediately, but the belief in harmful air outside was stronger than the discomfort inside. Every step taken in these rooms stirred the filth further. The fine dust that collected on carpets and curtains lifted easily into the air when disturbed. Each footfall became a small cloud of particles, breathed in with every breath. People grew used to coughing, to waking with clogged noses, and to feeling heaviness in their lungs. They explained these symptoms as ordinary weakness, never connecting them to the very rooms they slept in. Science was not advanced enough to show them the dangers of poor ventilation and constant dust. Comfort, or at least the illusion of it, outweighed all evidence. Furniture and decorations added even more layers of filth. Upholstered chairs, cushions and blankets filled bedrooms with texture and color. But they were almost never cleaned properly. Fabric trapped dirt, sweat and body oils. Over time, the smell of human presence grew stronger, masked only by perfume and occasional sprinklings of herbs. Cabinets and dressers collected dust along with moths, which chewed quietly at clothing stored inside. The more elaborate the room appeared, the more surfaces there were to trap filth. I cannot help but imagine standing in such a room, the air thick with dust and perfume, the curtains heavy with grime, yet being told this was the height of elegance. The silence around these conditions was striking. Just as women were forbidden to discuss men ration or body odor, few spoke openly of mold or bed bugs. To complain was to risk insulting the household. Guests stayed quiet. Servants kept their observations to themselves, and families pretended their rooms were spotless. The illusion of refinement was preserved at all costs, even when health suffered. Appearances were defended fiercely. Servants, as always, carried the heaviest burden. They beat carpets outdoors when ordered, choking on clouds of dust. They shook blankets and tried to scrub curtains, though true cleaning was impossible. Their own lungs are filled with the residue of coal, mold, and fabric fibers. Yet they were expected to present the rooms as perfect. Candles were lit, perfumes were sprayed, and visitors were impressed, never knowing what they were breathing in. For the servants, the glamorous rooms of their mistresses were workplaces of constant discomfort. Doctors began to notice the effects. Respiratory illnesses were common in cities. And while pollution from factories and coal played a role, the homes themselves contributed. Asthma, chronic coughs and tuberculosis spread quickly in environments with little air circulation and high levels of dust. Bedrooms became breeding grounds for disease as much as for comfort. Still, cultural superstition about fresh air made it nearly impossible to change practices. People continued to seal themselves inside rooms full of bacteria and mold, believing they were safer than if they had opened the window. The problem was not limited to the wealthy. Middle class and even poor families tried to imitate the style of heavy decoration. Cheaper fabrics and imitation carpets were used, but they trapped dirt in the same way. With fewer resources to clean them, the problem in modest homes was often worse. Rooms became small boxes of dust and odor, places of rest that quietly undermined health. The desire to appear refined outweighed the reality of discomfort across all classes. At night, the consequences grew stronger. Curtains shut out air entirely. Feather mattresses trapped heat and carpets released the day's collected dust. People lay in bed, breathing the damp, stale air. Convinced they were safe, they woke up coughing with sore throats and clogged noses, but thought of these as natural complaints of the season. Rarely did anyone question the rooms themselves. Bedrooms were meant to symbolize comfort and wealth, and so they were excused, no matter how unhealthy they became. The luxurious bedroom was not a sanctuary, but a trap. Curtains, carpets and bedding created elegance that masked filth. The air grew heavy, mold crept in, and bacteria flourished. People slept each night in what we now recognize as unsanitary conditions, but they accepted it as proper. Appearances once again won over health, and silence allowed the practice to continue for decades. Curtains rotted with dust, mattresses swarmed with insects, and carpets held the smell of years. Feet stirred clouds of filth with every step, and air was never renewed. The illusion of elegance remained, but beneath it was decay. And while the rooms were unhealthy, another part of the body suffered just as much, ignored and hidden beneath layers of clothing: the feet of Victorian women. Among all the hidden corners of Victorian hygiene, the feet of women stood out as one of the most neglected. Heavy gowns that reached the floor concealed them completely, while layers of stockings and boots kept them out of sight because they were hidden. They were also ignored. Feet carried women through the crowded, filthy streets of industrial cities. Yet they were rarely washed, rarely checked, and almost never spoken of in polite company. The result was that beneath elegant dresses and polished shoes, the feet of Victorian women became some of the dirtiest parts of their bodies. Stockings were usually made from wool or thick cotton. These fabrics trapped sweat and held moisture against the skin throughout the day. Shoes were made of stiff leather, often too tight and rarely allowed for any ventilation. Hours of walking or standing meant that feet were always damp, compressed, and deprived of air. Removing the shoes at night released a smell that many ignored, but none could deny. It is almost ironic that women could spend hours preparing their hair and faces with powders and perfumes while their feet rotted silently in the dark. The daily challenge of cleaning made matters worse. Gowns were cumbersome with multiple layers that made bending or crouching awkward. Reaching the feet to wash them properly was difficult, especially for women in corsets. Many simply chose not to. Water itself was distrusted and soap was unpleasant. So feet remained enclosed in stockings day after day, accumulating dirt and sweat. Some women might splash water quickly over them on rare occasions, but daily washing was far from routine. The neglect showed clearly in the toenails. With little care or trimming, nails grew long, jagged, and darkened with dirt. Yet this was no cause for embarrassment. As long as feet were hidden, their condition did not matter. Society judged women by the cleanliness of their faces, the brightness of their gowns, and the refinement of their manners. Feet were excluded from this judgment, and so they were left to decay. If compared to today, it would be like polishing one's jewelry every day while never brushing one's teeth, convinced that what people could not see did not matter. Infections were inevitable. Fungus thrived in the damp environment of stockings and boots. Blisters formed from constant rubbing, and wounds often became infected due to the filth that clung to the skin. The smell of unwashed feet filled bedrooms and parlors, though perfume tried to mask it. Servants were the ones who noticed most clearly. When they undressed their mistresses at night, they removed stockings damp with sweat, shoes lined with grime, and nails thick with dirt. They cleaned and repaired footwear, while the underlying problem remained unspoken. Foot care was also influenced by class. Wealthier women sometimes had more pairs of shoes and stockings, allowing them to rotate between them. But even then, washing feet was not common. For poorer women, the situation was worse. With only 1 or 2 pairs of stockings, they wore the same damp fabric day after day until it was nearly falling apart. Boots were rarely replaced, and their interiors became permanent breeding grounds for odor and disease. The poor endured discomfort openly, while the rich covered it with layers of fabric and perfume. The silence surrounding women's feet reflected the larger culture of denial. Just as men ration was never spoken of, neither were the realities of foot hygiene. To bring up the subject would have been considered vulgar. Instead, it was ignored. Even though almost everyone endured the same problems, guests might notice the odor in drawing rooms or during long carriage rides, but they never mentioned it. The illusion of refinement was preserved by silence. I cannot help but imagine the contradiction of a ballroom filled with perfume and silk, while beneath every dress were damp stockings and feet coated with filth. Medical texts of the time rarely addressed foot hygiene. Doctors might treat severe infections, but preventive care was almost never discussed. The cultural belief that feet were unimportant reinforced this neglect. Women accepted pain, swelling, and infection as natural parts of life. Only when conditions became unbearable did they seek treatment, often too late to avoid long-term damage. The contradiction is clear. The very part of the body most in contact with the dirty streets of Victorian cities was the one least cared for. Shoes picked up mud, horse manure, and industrial waste, which seeped through cracks into stockings. Feet absorbed this filth daily, but women had no habits of proper cleaning to remove it. Instead, they carried it into their homes, into their beds, and into their daily lives, hidden beneath layers of fabric. In the end, the neglect of women's feet was another reflection of Victorian priorities. What was visible was polished, perfumed, and powdered until it gleamed. What was hidden was ignored completely. No matter how foul it became, the body was divided into parts that mattered and parts that did not. Feet fell into the latter category, and their condition revealed the truth that appearances mattered far more than health. Feet remained damp in stockings, nails grew black with dirt, and infections spread silently. Society ignored them, women endured them, and servants managed them in silence. And while the feet suffered in darkness, the rest of the body was not much cleaner. For many women believed perfume alone could replace true washing. Victorian women lived in a culture where appearance was everything. And nowhere was this more obvious than in how they treated their own bodies. Instead of washing with water and soap, many relied on perfume as their main form of cleaning. Bottles of strong scent stood ready on dressing tables, not only for dabbing behind the ears, but also for wiping down parts of the body. The perfume itself often contained high levels of alcohol, which stung the skin sharply. Yet for many women, this pain was preferable to facing the smell of soap made from animal fat, or the inconvenience of bathing. To them, wiping with perfume was enough. The method was simple. A cloth or handkerchief was soaked in perfume, then pressed against the underarm's neck or groin. The alcohol evaporated quickly, leaving behind a powerful floral or musky scent. The odor of sweat was masked, and the woman appeared clean to those around her. The ritual gave the impression of refinement, though no real dirt was removed. It is almost ridiculous that entire households accepted burning alcohol and perfume as a substitute for bathing. But in the Victorian age, this was common, even admired. The side effects were severe. Skin treated in this way became raw, red, and irritated. Continuous wiping with perfume led to rashes, peeling, and sometimes blisters. Women endured the discomfort in silence, convinced that suffering was the price of beauty. Powder could be applied over damaged areas, concealing the irritation. The more the skin burned, the more perfume was applied to cover the smell. A cycle formed where harm was mistaken for refinement. Perfume also became a way to manage clothing. Heavy gowns absorbed sweat and odor, and without regular washing, they grew unpleasant quickly. Women sprayed perfume directly onto fabric, especially around the collar and underarms. The result was an overpowering mix of sweat, alcohol, and floral oils. To the Victorians, this was a mark of elegance. To us, it reads more like a declaration of decay. If compared to today, it would be like skipping showers entirely and simply spraying deodorant on the same clothes for weeks, calling it hygiene. The comparison shows how appearances replaced reality in daily life. Servants bore the brunt of this practice. They were the ones who prepared and refilled perfume bottles, who laundered clothes reeking of alcohol and sweat, and who watched their mistresses' W's from irritation while continuing the habit. They handled cloth stained with perfume and body oils, soaking them in water that quickly turned cloudy. Yet they remained silent because to comment would mean questioning their mistress's refinement. The culture of silence once again protected habits that harmed more than helped. Perfume was also used in more intimate ways. Some women wiped between their legs with perfumed cloths, hoping to mask natural odor. The alcohol stung badly, causing swelling and pain, but the illusion of cleanliness mattered more. Others dabbed perfume across the chest, even on broken or irritated skin, despite the obvious damage it caused. I cannot help but imagine the discomfort of standing in a crowded ballroom, smiling through the sting of raw skin covered in perfume while pretending to be the picture of grace. This practice crossed class lines. Wealthier women had access to expensive perfumes with complex floral notes, while poorer women used cheaper, harsher scents. But the effect was the same strong odor meant to mask the lack of bathing. The poor often stretched bottles by diluting them, producing weaker versions that still irritated the skin. The wealthy drowned themselves in the most fashionable scents, leaving rooms heavy with perfume. Both groups shared the same contradiction, masking filth rather than removing it. Doctors occasionally warned against the overuse of alcohol-based perfumes, noting the skin damage they caused. But these warnings were lost in a society where propriety mattered more than health. A pale face powdered white, a gown that smelled of roses, and a smile of composure were all that counted. The burns beneath the perfume, the infections hidden by powder were ignored. Hygiene was measured not by cleanliness, but by appearances. The habit also reflected the Victorian fear of water. Many still believed that bathing too often weakened the body or exposed it to illness. Perfume seemed like a safer, even superior option. It required little effort, left a strong impression, and avoided the risks that people associated with water. In truth, it created new risks, replacing dirt with chemicals that slowly harm the skin. Yet the cultural preference for illusion kept the bottles in constant use. Bedrooms and parlors smelled thickly of perfume, heavy enough to overwhelm visitors. Behind that scent lay sweat-soaked gowns, irritated skin, and cloth stained from repeated wiping. The contradiction was obvious, but never discussed. Silence preserved the illusion, just as it did with so many other aspects of Victorian hygiene. Perfume was wiped across the body, sprayed on clothes, and trusted to replace water and soap. Skin burned, fabric wire, and discomfort was hidden beneath layers of scent. And some women went even further, pouring perfume directly onto intimate areas in an attempt to mask odor, with consequences even more damaging than raw skin. Behind the elegance of gowns and jewelry, some of the most desperate hygiene habits took place in private. Strong perfume, already used to wipe the neck, underarms, and chest, was also poured onto cloths and applied between the legs. The belief was simple: if perfume could mask sweat elsewhere, then it could do the same in more hidden places. The reality, however, was painful and dangerous. The alcohol in the perfume stung sharply, leaving redness, swelling, and burning that lasted long after the ritual. Yet women continued, convinced that the sharp pain meant it was working. It is almost absurd that what was meant to make them appear refined in society involved pouring chemicals onto the most sensitive parts of their bodies. Perfume was not the only liquid used. Some women turned to spirits like gin or brandy, rubbing them into the skin as if they were cleansers. These drinks were already strong enough to burn the throat when swallowed on exposed flesh. The effect was severe, but desperation outweighed discomfort. Odora was feared as a sign of uncleanliness, and women preferred pain over the risk of being judged. The cultural silence around health meant that no one admitted how much damage this caused. Infection spread quietly, while society praised elegance and self-control. The practice left marks both physical and hidden. Skin became raw, sometimes covered in sores. But these were rarely shown to anyone. Women endured in silence, applying more powder and perfume on top of the damage. For many, the burning sensation was treated as proof that the method was successful, even though it only worsened the condition. If compared to today, it would be like taking industrial floor cleaner and applying it to the body, then insisting that the pain was a sign of cleanliness. The contrast shows how powerful the illusion of refinement was, strong enough to override common sense. Doctors occasionally encountered the results. Women visited in secret, suffering from infections that had spread after repeated use of alcohol or perfume. But even then, the conversations were discreet. To admit openly that perfume had been poured into such places was unthinkable. Physicians treated the symptoms while maintaining silence. No warnings were published. No campaigns began. The practice survived in the shadows, shielded by shame and reinforced by society's obsession with appearances. Servants sometimes witnessed the aftermath. They laundered stained cloths that smelled of alcohol and perfume. Realizing what they had been used for, they prepared bottles of scent for their mistresses, knowing some would never be sprayed on gowns, but instead used in secret. Yet, as always, they said nothing. The culture of silence extended from the highest lady to the lowest maid, binding everyone into the same complicity. I cannot help but imagine the discomfort of those women, forced to smile at dinners while carrying infections from habits they dared not name. This ritual was not limited to a particular class. Wealthy women had access to finer perfumes and expensive spirits, while poorer women relied on cheaper cologne or diluted liquor. But the method was the same. Pain followed by silence, followed by more perfume. Across drawing rooms and slums alike, women endured the same hidden suffering. The contradiction with Victorian ideals of morality was striking. A society that lectured constantly about purity and modesty tolerated habits that destroyed health in silence. To appear clean mattered more than to be clean. Women risked infections, fevers, and long-term illness rather than face the possibility of odor. The body became secondary to the illusion of refinement. In private chambers, the bottle stood ready, a cloth dipped in perfume or gin, a quick wipe, and the ritual was complete. The smell of alcohol lingered briefly before being covered with more powder or a floral scent. To the outside world, the woman appeared composed and graceful. Beneath the surface, her skin burned and her health deteriorated. The pain was carried silently, dismissed as a private matter, never to be discussed. The habit endured because it fit perfectly into the wider culture of silence. Just as men ration, body odor, and bedroom filth were never spoken of, neither were these private rituals. Women lived with their discomfort as if it were part of their duty. To refuse would mean risking shame. To speak would mean breaking the rules of propriety. So they endured, and the cycle continued across generations. Perfume was poured where no scent should be. Spirits burned skin in the name of refinement. And the end was often the same: quiet visits to doctors, secret treatments, and a return to silence. Behind closed doors, what society called elegance was leaving women scarred and sick. Perfumed cloths left burns, spirits deepened infections, and silence ensured nothing changed. Beneath the gowns and jewelry was hidden damage. And while the body suffered in secret, another layer of neglect revealed itself in the way clothes were washed so rarely that filth became part of daily life. Clothing defined the appearance of Victorian women more than almost anything else. The layers of fabric, the bright trims, and the heavy skirts all worked together to create an image of elegance and respectability. But beneath the polished surface lay a truth that most households preferred to ignore. These dresses were rarely cleaned. For many women, washing an entire gown happened no more than once a month. Between those rare washings, the same garment was worn repeatedly, layered with undercloth and sprayed with perfume until it was too dirty to ignore. What appeared to be an image of refinement was in reality a compromise with filth. The problem began with the nature of the dresses themselves. Victorian gowns were not light or simple. They were made with thick fabrics like wool, silk, and cotton, layered together into skirts that could weigh several kilg. Washing such a garment was not a matter of tossing it into water. It required hours of labor. Servants had to haul buckets, heat water, scrub by hand, and hang the gowns to dry, often taking an entire day or more. Once wet, the fabric was even heavier, and drying it fully could take several days. Because of this, women preferred to avoid washing their gowns whenever possible. Instead of cleaning, they turned to concealment. Spots of dirt on skirts were covered with ribbons, lace, or small decorative flowers pinned over the fabric. Stains on bodices were disguised with scarves or sashes. The idea was not to remove the filth, but to hide it from sight, as long as the gown looked acceptable at a distance. No one dared to ask about its condition up close. It is almost laughable that women spent so much energy pinning decorations onto filthy fabric instead of simply washing it. Yet, the practice was considered practical and even clever. For daily life, many women wore the same dress again and again. They rotated between 2 or 3 gowns if they were fortunate, but each was treated the same way. Instead of water and soap, quick fixes were used. Servants sometimes took crumpled paper or scraps of cloth to dab at oily marks, blotting them away without truly removing them. This dry cleaning method was thought to freshen the fabric without risking water damage. In truth, it only spread the dirt more thinly, leaving the gowns still soiled. Perfume was also pressed into service. Strong scents were sprayed directly onto fabric to cover the odor of sweat and mildew. The result was an overwhelming mix of roses, lavender, and decay, clinging to every layer of cloth. Visitors might notice the strength of the perfume, but never speak of it openly. The illusion of cleanliness remained intact, protected by silence. If compared to modern standards, it would be like wearing the same shirt every day for a month, masking the odor with deodorant and insisting it was still fresh. The absurdity becomes clear only when the silence of that time is broken. The labor of caring for these dresses fell mostly on servants. Laundresses and maids worked tirelessly to maintain garments that were rarely washed but constantly worn. When the time finally came for a full cleaning, the task was immense. Heating water, scrubbing heavy skirts, rinsing and drying them consumed entire days. Servants strained their backs, lifting wet fabric, and their hands burned from soap and hot water. Yet their work was invisible. Mistresses displayed their gowns in public as if they were effortlessly elegant, while the cost in sweat and pain was hidden behind the household walls. I cannot help but think of the sheer exhaustion of a servant spending days scrubbing a dress that her mistress had allowed to rot with dirt for weeks. The consequences for health were significant. Dresses worn day after day collected sweat, dust, and bacteria. Layers close to the skin absorbed oils and body odor, then pressed them tightly against the flesh. Rashes and infections became common, especially in the folds where fabric rubbed constantly. Women endured itching, burning, and sores, but rarely connected these problems to their clothing. Doctors sometimes advised more frequent washing, but their words carried little weight against the culture of appearance and convenience. Class did not change this habit. Wealthier women owned more dresses, but the gowns were equally heavy and difficult to wash. Instead of laundering, they rotated through larger wardrobes, allowing each gown to rest while still unwashed. Poorer women with only a few gowns wore the same one until it was nearly falling apart. In both cases, the result was the same filth hidden beneath decoration. The difference was only in how many gowns were available to disguise it. The superstition against frequent washing also played a role. Many believed that too much contact with water weakened the fabric, causing colors to fade or materials to wear out. As a result, even families who could afford more frequent laundering avoided it. Preservation of clothing mattered more than the cleanliness of the body. To lose a fine gown to water damage was considered a greater disaster than to wear a filthy one in public. Social gatherings made the contradiction more visible. Ballrooms filled with women in brightly decorated gowns, each appearing fresh and grand. Yet beneath the candlelight, the smell of sweat, perfume, and mildew lingered. Guests noticed but said nothing. To comment would have been impolite. a violation of the silence that kept society's illusions intact. Everyone played along, pretending that elegance was untainted by the filth clinging to the very fabrics that symbolized it. This reliance on decoration and perfume, rather than washing, shows once again how deeply appearances shaped Victorian life. Gowns were not meant to be clean. They were meant to be convincing. Lace hid stains, ribbons covered dirt, and perfume disguised odor. Women moved through society, wrapped in layers of filth that looked beautiful at a distance. The body beneath suffered. The servants who cleaned suffered, but the illusion of refinement was preserved, month after month. Gowns were worn, patched with decoration, dabbed with paper, and sprayed with perfume. Only when the dirt could no longer be hidden did a full washing take place, consuming days of labor and leaving the dress heavy and stiff. By then, infections had already spread, odor had already settled, and the cycle began again. Dresses grew heavier with filth, servants worked themselves raw, and women endured rashes in silence. The illusion of refinement stayed intact, even as health declined. And while the gowns revealed one layer of neglect, the very baths meant to clean the body offered no relief, for they too were filled with filth, insects, and disease. Bathing in the Victorian era was not a simple matter of turning on a tap and stepping into clean water. For many families, even the wealthier ones, a bath was considered a rare luxury rather than a daily routine. Bathrooms as we know them did not exist in most homes, and plumbing was limited or absent altogether. Instead, families relied on portable tubs, heavy wooden or metal containers that were filled manually with heated water. This process required hours of work from servants, who had to carry bucket after bucket from the kitchen or yard, heat the water over fires, and pour it into the tub. By the time the bath was ready, the water was already cooling, and the effort involved meant that the practice was infrequent. Most people bathed only occasionally, sometimes just once a week, and in poorer households, even less often. The tubs themselves were far from the gleaming porcelain we imagine today. They were often made of tin, copper, or wood, lined with metal, and they quickly collected grime. Without drains, water had to be scooped out manually once the bath was finished. Emptying was as laborious as filling, so families stretched each bath as far as possible. That meant the same water was often reused by several members of a household. The father might bathe first, followed by the mother, then the children in descending order of age. By the time the last child sat in the tub, the water was lukewarm, grey, and filled with residue. It is almost laughable that a ritual intended for cleanliness ended with the youngest members of the family soaking in the filth of everyone else. What floated on the surface told the real story. Soap scum gathered quickly, forming oily layers. Body hair, flakes of skin, and general dirt clung together in clusters. Dust from coal fires carried in on clothes and hair joined the mix. In many cases, insects were also present. Water carried into the tub was not always clean to begin with, often drawn from wells or systems where beetles, flies, or larvae thrived. By the time the bath was prepared, a thin line of floating bugs often ringed the water. Families tolerated this as part of the process, scooping them aside before climbing in. If compared to today, it would be like filling a bathtub with water scooped from a roadside puddle, sharing it with the whole family and calling it luxury. For servants, the bath was both exhausting and humiliating. They did the heavy work of preparing the water, but rarely had a chance to use the bath themselves. Their own hygiene was managed with quick washes from basins or buckets, if at all. While their employers soaked in what they believed was refinement, servants scrubbed their mistresses' discarded filth from the tub, often while enduring ridicule for smelling of labor. The divide between classes was reinforced even in bathing, with the poor handling water they were never allowed to enjoy. I cannot help but think of the irony. The ones who worked hardest to prepare the bath were the ones denied the very comfort they provided. Even for the wealthy, bathing was not daily. Elaborate bathrooms with marble tubs and plumbing existed only in the grandest houses. For everyone else, the portable tub remained the norm. Weekly bathing was considered more than sufficient, and in many circles, too much bathing was even discouraged. Doctors sometimes warned that frequent washing could weaken the body, strip away natural oils, or expose the system to cold air. These superstitions reinforced the idea that perfume and powder could substitute for water. The water itself was often unsafe. In cities like London, water supplies were heavily polluted with sewage. Even when boiled for baths, impurities remained. Families soaking in such water exposed themselves to infections of the skin and eyes. Complaints of rashes, sores and itching were common, though few connected them directly to the baths. The association of bathing with cleanliness was strong enough to override the obvious evidence. The smell of a bath lingered long after it was finished. Steam rose from the water, carrying the odor of sweat, soap and decay into the air. In cramped homes, the dampness clung to walls, encouraging mold. Bathrooms, when they existed, were among the least ventilated rooms in the house. The combination of stagnant water, damp fabrics, and poor air circulation turned them into breeding grounds for bacteria. Yet, these rooms were still presented as marks of refinement when visitors came. The illusion of cleanliness outweighed the discomfort of reality. In poorer households, the picture was harsher. Many did not have tubs at all, relying instead on a basin and a rag for washing. Families crowded into small rooms, taking turns wiping down with water that was changed only occasionally. Shared basins meant shared contamination, but it was accepted as the only option. Baths, when they occurred,